to John chapter 19. John chapter 19. In a minute we'll begin reading in verse 16, but I want to tell you a little story. When I moved to my present job, I found myself hanging out a lot in Catholic churches and began to notice some of the common features in different churches and ask questions about some things. One of the things that I noticed was that every church seems to have 14 stations of the cross around the rooms. Many of you have seen those. They basically describe the actions that happened along the way to the cross. In America, we see, or as I began to ask questions, I found that very few of my coworkers, even those who were Catholic, knew much about them. They could tell you what they were, but they couldn't tell you anything about the history or anything like that. So, me being me, I decided I would learn a little about them. And I found they have a very interesting story. In America, there are always 14. In Europe, they vary anywhere from 12 to 20. And there's a reason for that. It has to do with the history of these particular displays. You see, if you go back to your world history of Western civilization, you'll remember that something pretty major happened at the end of the Middle Ages called the Crusades. That is, that the Pope called for Christian knights from across Christendom to travel to the Holy Land to retake it from the barbarians who had occupied it. And so from every area of the Christianized world, which is basically Europe, remember, America had not yet been discovered. From basically the entire Europe, all of Europe, they sent knights, mostly Western Europe. And these knights traveled to the Holy Land, and they were able to reconquer the holy city of Jerusalem. And then they did what people do when they come to town on business. They became tourists. And they wanted to see all the places they'd read so much about, they'd heard so much about. Most of them couldn't read. But they'd heard so much about from the Bible stories. And so they began to look for some of these. And some of the natives, the Palestinians, the Arabs there, decided they had two options. They could continue to oppose these heavily armed Christians, or they could make a little money off of them. And so they began to give tours and to set up souvenir stands. Matter of fact, if you go there today, you can still buy an authentic piece of the cross right there at the souvenir stand at the Calvary. And all along this road, they set up these souvenir stands, these markers. The only problem was they quickly ran out of stories from the Bible. And being enterprising young people, they made a couple up. Oh, you haven't heard of the story of? And sold trinkets that would remind the knights of their visit to this holy site. And so all during that time period, and by the way, down to this day, you'll find souvenir stands all along this road that leads from Jerusalem to Calvary. And depending on how much you pay your tour guide, he may show you 2 or 3 roads with 2 or 3 different Calvaries. But that's another story. But all along this road, They had these stands. But when the knights got back to Europe, everybody wanted to say, what did you see? Did you see? And start asking about things they had seen in the Bible. And so the knights would set up their little trinkets, their statuary, their things along the edge of the church as a physical piece. Here's a piece of the cross. Reminders, down to today, of these medieval souvenir stands along this road they call the Via Dolorosa, the Way of Sorrows. I want us to think together a little bit this morning about the Via Dolorosa, not necessarily the physical road, though we'll talk a little bit about it, but this way of sorrows that Jesus traveled. Let's look at John chapter 19. He's just had his trial before Pilate. And John picks up here. So he then handed him over to them to be crucified. They took Jesus, therefore, and he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of the skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. And there they crucified him, and with him 2 other men, one on either side, and Jesus in between. And Pilate also wrote an inscription and put it on the cross. It was written, Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews. Therefore many of the Jews read this inscription, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, Latin, and in Greek. So the chief priests of the Jews were saying to Pilate, do not write the King of the Jews, but that he said, I am King of the Jews. Pilate answered, what I have written, I have written. Then the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took his outer garments and made 4 parts, a part for every soldier, and also the tunic. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece. So they said to one another, let us not tear it, but cast lots for it, to decide whose it shall be. This was to fulfill the scripture. They divided my outer garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Therefore the soldiers did these things, but standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus then saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, woman, behold your son. Then he said to the disciple, behold your mother. From that hour, the disciple took her into his own household. After this, Jesus, knowing that all things had already been accomplished to fulfill the scripture, said, I'm thirsty. A jar full of sour wine was standing there, so they put in a sponge full of the sour wine upon a branch of hyssop and brought it up to his mouth. Therefore, when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, it is finished. And he bowed his head and he gave up his spirit. I want to ask you a question. Are you willing to follow Jesus down the road of sorrows? Are you willing to follow Jesus as far as it takes? Jesus had come to each of these disciples, these 12, and said, follow me. When did he countermand that instruction? He didn't. He asked them to follow him. And they did. Follow me and I'll make you fishers of men. Follow me, he said to them. And they followed him. For 3 years, they followed. They learned. They taught. They fellowshiped. They cried. For 3 years, they saw their numbers grow as thousands came to hear Jesus speak. As thousands came to be healed, to be fed. followed. That night before, they had all enjoyed a meal together. A Passover meal, a celebration, a time of wonder, a time of glory. And yet it had a somber tone for no apparent reason. Jesus was trying to tell them something. They weren't real sure what it was, but they really didn't like it. And they followed. They went out to the Garden of Gethsemane. And Jesus said to 9 of the 12, "You wait here. You three come a little further with me." John was one of those. And they followed him a little further. And he said, "You wait here. I'll be back." The hour was late. They had enjoyed the party. And they were sleeping by the time Jesus came back. They had followed, but they'd fallen asleep. Who can blame them? The hour was late. They saw Jesus arrested. And they scattered. A couple of them followed Jesus to the home of the high priest for his trial. There's some question as to exactly, we know one of them was Peter. There's some question as to exactly who the other one is. As I looked at biblical scholars, one of the things that they pretty much all, the only thing they all agreed on was they sure do wish John had told us which disciple it was that got Peter into that house that night. Was it John himself? Did he somehow know the high priest? Or was it one of the other disciples? Perhaps one of the Judean disciples who'd come along. Well, not one of the 12. We don't know. They pretty much are divided on that point. Some suggest it was John. He's very specific about not naming himself. Some have suggested it was someone else, but they followed him. Right up until the point where the third servant asks, "Hey, aren't you one of his disciples?" And Peter lets go a couple of expletives with a no behind it. John followed. You see, after a formal trial in front of Pilate, the display there, and after Jesus is beaten, they walk him down the Via Dolorosa, and John follows all the way. And as Jesus is hanging there on the cross, he looks down and he sees his mother, his aunt, this young woman, Mary Magdalene, whom he had been one of his disciples. A young woman whom he had healed from demonic possession. And he looks there and sees John standing there. He's come all the way. He was one of the first disciples, and he's come all the way. And he looks at him and says, "Behold your mother." Now, it was Jesus' responsibility as the firstborn to take care of his mother. If something happened to Jesus, it was the responsibility of the second-born son to take over that. John wasn't one of the sons. Would have been one of Jesus' brothers who was responsible for that. Instead, he looks at John, who's come all the way with him, and says, "Behold your mother." And then Jesus, according to John, says, "I'm thirsty." And cries out, "It is finished." And he dies. How far down the way of sorrows are you willing to go? How far are you willing to follow Jesus? I could stop there. But guess who shows back up 2 days later? Peter and John running to the tomb. And John is running harder than Peter. He's followed him all the way down the road of sorrows. He can't wait to see an empty tomb. How far are you willing to follow? The hymn says, "Footprints of Jesus that make that pathway to love." We will follow the steps of Jesus wherever they go. I'm going to tell you that Christ is calling us to go into this community. Maybe it's your neighborhood. Maybe it's a relationship that you haven't thought about in years. Maybe it's a relationship you've been praying for decades. Maybe it's somebody at work. God is calling us to follow Him down the road of sorrows to people who are in need. To people who need Jesus most of all. How far will you go down the road of sorrows? God is calling us to tread that path. He never claimed that it would be easy. A few chapters before this, James and John walk up to Jesus and say, "Lord, we want to ask you to do whatever we ask from you." Jesus, being no fool, isn't about to make that kind of promise. I don't think you or I would either. Well, that depends on what it is. We want to sit on your right hand and your left. And Jesus looks at them and says, "Are you willing to drink the cup I'm going to drink from? Are you willing to be baptized with the baptism I'm going to be baptized with?" In a way, he was saying to them, "Are you willing to walk the way of sorrows with me?" Christ has called us as Christians to walk the way of sorrows, to be an influence, to be a healing presence in what has been described as the dark night of the soul. Are you willing to walk the way of sorrows? You've heard me say several times that I'm convinced that a time of persecution is coming. Nobody in America has been asked to die for Christ in years, decades, a couple of centuries. Are you willing, if it comes to that, to lay down your life to follow Christ? Are you willing to walk the way of sorrows? I don't know that it'll come to that in America. But I think things are going to get worse. I'm convinced. Are you willing to walk all the way to Calvary with you? Are you willing to spend the effort and the time to follow Christ, no matter where He leads? It's Easter Sunday. Christ is risen. Are you as excited as John and Peter at the prospect of a risen Christ calling you further? Of spending more quality time with Jesus? Of spending time with holiness with God? Will you walk the way of sorrows even through the empty tomb? We're going to sing a hymn of invitation here in a few moments. As we do, if God has convicted you of something this morning, I want you to come. If God has spoken to your heart and said you need to get something right, I want you to come. Whatever God has called you to do, I want you to come. As we sing, we will not sing long, but you come.
Sing hymn number 307.